The transport ship landed on Xerion Prime with a soft thud that shook the entire docking bay. Steam rose from the heated metal as the engines cooled down. Instructor Kaveth watched from the observation deck high above the landing pad. His forearms crossed over his chest as he looked down at the new arrivals. Today was different. Today a human was coming to his academy. The Galactic Combat Academy had trained warriors for over 200 years. Students came from every corner of known space. There were the Draconis with their thick scales that could stop most weapons. The Veil could turn their crystal bodies invisible and walk through walls. The Corvani had machines built into their bodies that made them faster and stronger than any natural being. But humans, they were new to this part of the galaxy. Most people knew them as the species that was good at talking and making plans. They were the ones who stayed far away from fights and used big guns when they had to fight at all. No human had ever asked to learn close combat fighting until now. Kaveth had been teaching at the academy for 30 years. He had seen every kind of student. Some were naturally gifted fighters. Others had to work hard to learn even basic moves. But all of them learned the same lesson he taught every day. Combat is about control. You must control your weapon, control how far you stand from your enemy, and control what choices your enemy can make. This was the way. This was how warriors had fought for thousands of years across hundreds of worlds. The transport door opened with a hiss. Several students walked out, carrying bags and looking around at their new school. Kaveth could see a young Draconis with bright green scales, a Veil whose crystal body sparkled in the sunlight, 2 Corvani with glowing eyes that showed their computer parts were working. Then he saw her. The human was not what he expected. She was not tall or short, not thick or thin. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple way. She wore plain clothes and carried only one small bag. Nothing about her looked special or dangerous. She looked like she could be a teacher or a shop worker or anything else that did not involve fighting. Her name was Sarah Chen, according to the files Kaveth had read. She came from something called the Terran Colonial Defense Force. The humans had sent her here to learn advanced close combat techniques. Kaveth had laughed when he first read those words. What could a human possibly want to learn about real fighting? Sarah walked across the landing pad with steady steps. She did not look around and wonder like most new students did. Instead, she seemed to be studying everything. Her eyes moved from the buildings to the other students to the instructors watching from above. When her gaze found Kaveth in the observation deck, she stopped and looked right at him. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Kaveth felt something strange. Most students looked at him with fear or respect or excitement. This human looked at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then she nodded once and continued walking toward the registration building. "What do you think of our new human?" asked Instructor Threx, walking up behind Kaveth. Threx was a Corvani with silver skin and glowing blue eyes. He taught weapons technology and armor systems. "She will not last long," Kaveth replied, turning away from the window. "Humans are not built for real combat. They are too soft, too slow, too weak." "The others are already making bets," Threx said with a laugh. "Most think she will quit in the first week. A few think she might make it to the end of the month." "What do you think?" Kaveth asked. Threx was quiet for a moment. "I think there is a reason the humans sent her here. They do not do anything without a good reason. Maybe we should watch her carefully." Kaveth made a sound of disagreement. "She is just another student who thinks fighting looks exciting in the movies. When she gets hit for the first time, she will remember that humans are meant to stay behind big guns and let others do the real fighting." But as he walked away from the observation deck, Kaveth could not stop thinking about the way Sarah had looked at him. It was not the look of someone who was scared or unsure. It was the look of someone who was planning something. The next morning, Kaveth stood in the main training hall with 20 new students. They were arranged in neat rows wearing the gray training clothes of first-year cadets. Sarah stood in the back row looking just as ordinary as she had the day before. "Welcome to the Galactic Combat Academy," Kaveth began, his voice echoing in the large room. "You are here because you want to learn how to fight. But before you can learn to fight, you must learn what fighting really is." He walked slowly in front of the students, his 4 arms moving as he talked. "Many of you think fighting is about being strong or fast or having good weapons. These things can help, but they are not what fighting is really about." Kaveth stopped and looked at each student. "Fighting is about control. You must control your weapon so it goes where you want it to go. You must control the distance between you and your enemy, so you can hit them but they cannot hit you. Most important, you must control what choices your enemy can make. A young Draconis raised his hand. What if the enemy is stronger than you? Then you control the fight so that strength does not matter, Kaveth answered. What if they are faster? You control the space so speed does not help them. What if they have better weapons? You control the situation so their weapons cannot be used properly. Sarah raised her hand. Kaveth nodded at her. What if you cannot control those things? She asked. Her voice was quiet but clear. Then you lose, Kaveth said simply. A warrior who cannot control the fight is not a warrior at all. They are just someone waving a weapon around and hoping for luck. But what if the problem is not that you are not controlling enough things? Sarah continued. What if the problem is that you are trying to control the wrong things? The room became very quiet. Other students turned to look at Sarah. Kaveth felt his chest tighten with anger. No first-day student had ever questioned his teaching before. Explain, he said in a cold voice. Sarah looked directly at him. You said we should control our weapons and the distance and our enemy's choices. But what if there are other things that matter more? Things that we are not thinking about? Such as? I do not know yet, Sarah said. That is why I am here to learn. Kaveth stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, but it was not a kind smile. Very well, Human Chen. Since you seem to think my methods might be wrong, perhaps you would like to demonstrate your own ideas. I would rather learn your methods first, Sarah replied calmly. Then I can understand them before I make any judgments. This answer surprised Kaveth. Most students who challenged him on the first day were too proud or too stupid to back down. But this human seemed genuinely interested in learning, even after questioning his teaching. We will see how long that attitude lasts, he said finally. Class dismissed. Tomorrow we begin with basic weapon forms. As the students filed out of the training hall, Kaveth watched Sarah carefully. She did not talk to the other students or look around the room like a tourist. Instead, she walked over to the weapons rack and began examining the training swords. She picked up a standard practice blade and held it up to the light. She ran her finger along the edge, tested the balance, and even tapped it gently against the floor. Then she put it back and picked up another one, doing the same tests. Interesting, Kaveth thought to himself. Most students wanted to swing swords around and feel powerful. This human was studying the weapons like a scientist would study a specimen. Maybe Instructor Threx was right. Maybe there was more to this human than he had first thought. But that did not change anything. Combat was about control, and he would teach her that lesson just like he had taught all the others. The only question was how long it would take for her to understand. As Sarah left the training hall, she paused at the door and looked back at Kaveth one more time. Again, he felt like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then she nodded and walked away. Kaveth stood alone in the empty training hall, surrounded by weapons and training equipment. For 30 years, he had taught the same lessons in the same way. Students came and went, but the truth never changed. Combat was about control, wasn't it? 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Chen arrived at the Galactic Combat Academy, and Instructor Kaveth was becoming more puzzled by her every day. She was not the worst student he had ever taught. Her basic sword forms were correct, if not graceful. She could handle an energy pike well enough to avoid hurting herself. When practicing with throwing knives, she hit the target more often than she missed. But she was never the best in any exercise, and she never seemed to care about being better than the other students. What bothered Kaveth was what she did when she thought no one was watching. After the regular training sessions ended, most students went to eat dinner or rest in their rooms. Some stayed to practice the moves they had learned that day. But Sarah did something different. She went to the Academy's Library and Research Center. The library was a place most combat students avoided. It was full of technical manuals about weapon design, material science, and engineering principles. The information was useful for people who made weapons and armor, but most fighters did not care about such things. They wanted to know how to use weapons, not how weapons were made. Sarah spent hours there every night. Kaveth finally decided to see what she was doing. He found her sitting at a table covered with books and data tablets. She had pulled up technical specifications for dozens of different weapons and armor types. Her notebook was filled with equations and diagrams that looked more like engineering homework than combat training notes. Is there a problem with the weapons we are using in class? Kaveth asked, walking up to her table. Sarah looked up from a book about metallurgy. No, sir, the weapons work fine for training. Then why are you studying their molecular structure? Sarah closed the book and looked at him carefully. Because I want to understand how they work. Not just how to swing them, but how they actually work. Why does that matter? Kaveth asked. A sword cuts because it has a sharp edge. A force pike delivers energy because it has a power cell. You do not need to understand the science to use them properly. Maybe, Sarah said. But what if understanding the science could help me use them better? Or what if it could help me fight against them better? Kaveth felt his irritation growing. These weapons have been used by warriors for thousands of years. The techniques for using them and fighting against them are already known. They are taught in my classes. I know, Sarah replied, and I am learning those techniques. But I am also curious about other things. She opened her notebook and showed him a page covered with drawings. For example, did you know that a Corvani energy blade generates heat in a very specific pattern? The center of the blade is actually cooler than the edges because of how the energy flows through the focusing crystal. What use is that knowledge? Kaveth asked. Probably none, Sarah admitted. But what if I needed to grab an energy blade for some reason? Knowing where the cool spot is might save my fingers. Kaveth stared at her. Why would you ever need to grab an energy blade? I do not know. Maybe I never will. But if I did, would it not be better to know how? This conversation was making Kaveth uncomfortable in a way he could not explain. Sarah was not arguing with him or claiming his methods were wrong. She was just asking questions that no one had ever asked before. The point of combat training, he said carefully, is to learn proven techniques that have worked for generations, not to waste time on theoretical situations that will never happen. I understand, Sarah said. That is why I study these things on my own time, not during class. Kaveth left the library feeling unsettled. Over the next few days, he began watching Sarah more closely during training sessions. What he saw made him even more confused. When they practiced sword fighting, Sarah would often ask strange questions. What happens if the power cell in an energy blade starts to fail? How much force would it take to bend a standard dueling sword? What materials are the training armor made from? When they practiced fighting against opponents with natural armor, like the Draconis students, Sarah wanted to know exactly how thick the scales were and whether they were stronger in some directions than others. During lessons about fighting in different environments, Sarah asked about gravity levels, atmospheric pressure, and ambient temperature. Most students just wanted to know how to adjust their fighting stance for low gravity or high heat. Sarah wanted to understand how these conditions would affect their weapons and equipment. The other instructors began to notice too. Your human student asks very odd questions, Instructor Vrex told Kaveth after a class on energy weapons. She wanted to know the resonant frequency of our practice force pikes. She asked me about stress fractures in crystalline armor, reported Instructor Nelth, who taught defensive techniques. Then she wanted to know if sonic attacks could create harmonic vibrations that might weaken crystal structures. Why does she care about these things? Wondered Instructor Thex. She is here to learn fighting, not engineering. Kaveth did not have an answer. He decided to talk to Sarah directly. He found her in the weapons maintenance room after classes one day. She was examining a damaged practice sword that had been bent during a training accident. The weapon was scheduled to be melted down and recycled, but Sarah was studying the bent metal like it contained important secrets. What are you learning from a broken weapon? Kaveth asked. Sarah looked up. I'm trying to understand why it broke in this specific way. The bend is not where I would expect it to be. She pointed to the curved part of the blade. Based on the force that was applied and the direction it came from, the sword should have bent closer to the hilt. But it bent here instead, which means there was already a weak point in the metal. So if I was fighting someone with a similar sword, and I knew where the weak points were likely to be, I might be able to break their weapon on purpose. Kaveth felt a chill run through his body. That is not how combat works. You cannot predict where a weapon will have flaws. Maybe not, Sarah agreed. But what if I could create the right kind of stress to find out? What if I could make a small crack become a big break? You are talking about destroying your opponent's weapon, Kaveth said slowly. That is not normally part of combat training. Why not? Sarah asked. If my enemy has no weapon, they cannot hurt me with it. That seems like it would be useful. Kaveth did not know how to answer that. In all his years of teaching, he had focused on techniques for using weapons and defending against them. The idea of deliberately destroying an opponent's weapon had never occurred to him. Besides, Sarah continued, You said that combat is about control. If I can control whether my opponent's weapon works or not, that seems like a pretty important kind of control. That night, Kaveth could not sleep. He kept thinking about Sarah's words and the way she looked at everything differently than other students did. The next day, during sword practice, he watched her more carefully than ever before. She was sparring with a Draconis student named Korath, who was much stronger and faster than she was. By all normal measures, Korath should have won easily, but something strange happened during their match. Every time Korath attacked, Sarah did not just block or dodge. She seemed to be studying his sword, watching how it moved and where the stress was greatest. When she blocked his attacks, she did not just stop them. She blocked them at specific angles that made his blade vibrate strangely. After several minutes of this, Korath's sword began to make a high-pitched humming sound with each strike. The Draconis student looked confused but kept fighting. Sarah continued to block at the same precise angles, and the humming got louder. Then, just as Korath was making a powerful overhead strike, his sword cracked. Not broke completely, but developed a long crack down the middle of the blade that made it impossible to use safely. "Faulty weapon," Kaveth announced, stopping the match. "Get a replacement blade." But as he handed Korath a new sword, Kaveth looked at Sarah. She was not surprised by what had happened. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting it. That evening, Kaveth went to the library. He found Sarah's usual table and sat down with some of the same books she had been reading. For the first time in 30 years, he began studying the science behind the weapons he had been teaching others to use. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about combat. Metals could be weakened by specific vibrations. Crystals could be shattered by sound waves at the right frequency. Energy fields could be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. Every material had properties that could be exploited if you understood the underlying physics. But most shocking of all was the realization that came to him as he read through page after page of technical specifications. Every weapon, no matter how well made, had weaknesses. Every armor, no matter how strong, had flaws. Every fighting technique, no matter how perfect, had counters that no one had thought to look for. Sarah was not just learning to fight. She was learning to find the breaking points in everything. And if she could do that, then everything Kaveth had taught about combat being based on control was wrong. Or maybe it was right. But he had been controlling the wrong things all along. The thought kept him awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what other assumptions about combat might be completely backward. In the morning, he would have to face Sarah in class again. And for the first time in 30 years, Instructor Kaveth was not sure what he was going to teach her. 2 months into the semester, Instructor Kaveth had begun to dread his morning classes, not because Sarah Chen was a bad student. In fact, she had improved dramatically in all the traditional combat skills. Her swordwork was now smooth and precise. She could handle energy weapons with confidence. Her defensive techniques were solid, and she had even begun to excel at hand-to-hand combat. What made Kaveth nervous was that Sarah had started asking questions that he could not answer. "Instructor," she said during a lesson on armor penetration, "what would happen if someone used a sonic disruptor tuned to the resonant frequency of Corvani cybernetic implants?" Kaveth paused in the middle of demonstrating a pike thrust. "Sonic disruptors are not standard combat weapons. I know. But some species have natural sonic abilities, and some environments create acoustic effects. So it could happen, right?" "I suppose it is possible," Kaveth admitted. "Then should we not learn how to defend against it?" Kaveth did not have a good answer for that question, or for most of the questions Sarah asked these days. The other students had begun to notice too. At first they had ignored the quiet human who asked weird questions. But now they were starting to listen to her ideas and ask their own questions. During a recent sparring session, a Veil student named Crystalline had asked, if phasing through matter uses quantum fluctuations, could electromagnetic interference disrupt the process? A Draconis named Flamescale wanted to know, if my scales are made of calcium carbonate, what chemicals could weaken them? Even the Corvani students, who were usually focused only on optimizing their cybernetic enhancements, began asking about potential vulnerabilities in their own systems. Kaveth found himself spending more and more time in the library, trying to stay ahead of his students' questions. The other instructors were having the same problem. "She is turning them all into engineers instead of warriors," complained Instructor Vrex during a faculty meeting. They spend more time analyzing weapons than learning to use them. Maybe that is not entirely bad, suggested Instructor Threx. Some of their insights have been quite valuable. Did you know that standard force pikes can be overloaded to create an electromagnetic pulse? Cadet Chen figured that out last week. That is not the point, Kaveth said firmly. We are here to teach proven combat techniques, not to encourage students to experiment with dangerous theories. But even as he said it, Kaveth was not sure he believed it anymore. Some of Sarah's dangerous theories had turned out to be remarkably effective, like the incident with the Draconis student who had seemed impossible to defeat in close combat. His natural armor was too thick for standard training weapons to penetrate, and he was strong enough to overpower most opponents easily. Sarah had asked to study the composition of Draconis scales, then spent 3 days in the chemistry lab. When she faced the student in combat, she carried a small spray bottle filled with what looked like water. That is not a weapon. The Draconis had laughed. No, Sarah agreed. It is a solvent. One spray across his arm scales, and the Draconis discovered that his impenetrable armor could be dissolved by a simple acid solution. The scales did not disappear, but they became soft enough that normal training weapons could pierce them. The Draconis student was not hurt, but he was completely shocked. His natural advantage had vanished in seconds. This is not fair, he protested. You cannot just make weapons out of random chemicals. Why not? Sarah asked. You use your natural scales as armor. I use natural chemistry as a weapon. What is the difference? Kaveth had to end the exercise because he did not know how to answer that question either. Word of these incidents began to spread beyond the academy. Other schools and military organizations started asking questions about the new teaching methods being developed on Zerion Prime. Some wanted to send observers. Others requested copies of the lesson plans. The problem was that there were no lesson plans. Sarah was not following any curriculum. She was just looking at everything from angles that no one else had considered. Academy Director Olthan called Kaveth to his office to discuss the situation. I am getting reports that your classes have become quite unconventional, the director said. He was an elderly Corvani, whose cybernetic eyes glowed a soft blue as he reviewed data on his desk display. Students are requesting access to engineering facilities, chemistry labs, and physics research equipment. This is a combat academy, not a university. The students are still learning combat skills, Kaveth replied carefully. Their test scores in traditional techniques have actually improved. Yes, I noticed that. But I also noticed that they are learning other things that are not part of our standard curriculum, things that some people might consider concerning. Kaveth understood what the director meant. Teaching students to find weaknesses in equipment and armor was one thing. Teaching them to create improvised weapons from common materials was something else entirely. Are you suggesting we should stop these activities? Kaveth asked. Director Olthan was quiet for a long moment. I am suggesting that we need to be very careful about what we are teaching and why. The academy has a reputation to maintain. We train warriors, not saboteurs or terrorists. That conversation stayed with Kaveth for days. He began watching Sarah even more closely, trying to understand what she was really doing and why. What he saw surprised him. Sarah was not trying to turn her fellow students into criminals or troublemakers. If anything, she was teaching them to be more aware of their environment and more thoughtful about how they approached problems. When a Veil student became frustrated because he could not phase through a particular type of barrier, Sarah helped him analyze the barrier's composition and energy field. Together, they figured out how to adjust his phasing frequency to get through it. When a Corvani student's cybernetic enhancements malfunctioned during training, Sarah showed her how to diagnose the problem using basic principles of electrical engineering. The student was able to fix the issue herself instead of waiting for a technician. Sarah was not teaching destruction. She was teaching understanding, but understanding, Kaveth realized, could be more dangerous than any weapon. A student who understood how things worked could figure out how to break them. A warrior who knew the science behind their equipment could turn that knowledge against an enemy. Knowledge itself became a tool that could be used for good or evil. As the semester drew toward its end, Kaveth found himself facing a decision he had never expected to make. The final examination was approaching. Tradition required each student to face their instructor in single combat using their chosen weapon. It was not about winning or losing. It was about demonstrating what they had learned and how they had grown as warriors. But what if Sarah had learned things that went beyond traditional combat? What if her approach to fighting was so different from anything he knew that he could not properly evaluate it? Worse, what if she had become so skilled at finding weaknesses that she could actually defeat him? Kaveth had never lost a final examination match. In 30 years of teaching, no student had ever come close to beating him in combat. His reputation and authority depended on maintaining that record. But as he watched Sarah practice her forms in the training hall, moving with quiet confidence and studying every weapon and technique with those calculating eyes, he began to wonder if this year might be different. The thought both terrified and excited him. 3 days before the final examinations were scheduled to begin, Sarah approached him after class. "Instructor Kaveth," she said formally, "I would like to request permission to use a traditional Xerion dueling sword for my final examination." Kaveth was surprised. That is an unusual choice. Most students prefer energy weapons or force pikes for the final test. "I have been studying historical combat techniques," Sarah explained. "I think I would like to try something more traditional." "A dueling sword requires great skill to use effectively," Kaveth warned. "They have no energy field to help cut through armor, no power cell to boost their effectiveness. They rely entirely on the user's technique and understanding." Sarah nodded. "I understand. That is why I want to use one." "Very well," Kaveth agreed. "You may select a dueling sword from the historical weapons collection." As Sarah walked away, Kaveth felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. She had chosen the most difficult weapon available, one that required not just skill but deep understanding of leverage, timing, and precision. It was almost as if she was trying to prove something, or maybe she was planning something that no one would expect. That night, Kaveth could not sleep again. He kept thinking about all the questions Sarah had asked over the past months, all the strange experiments she had conducted, all the assumptions about combat she had quietly challenged. Tomorrow would be the final examinations. Sarah would face him in combat, and he would finally see what she had really learned. For the first time in his teaching career, Instructor Kaveth was not sure who would be the teacher and who would be the student when the match began. But he was certain of one thing. Whatever happened tomorrow would change everything. He thought he knew about combat, and maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. The final examination day arrived with clear skies and bright sunlight streaming through the combat arena's transparisteel dome. Students, instructors, and academy staff filled the observation seats that surrounded the circular fighting floor. This was the most important day of the semester, when each cadet would demonstrate everything they had learned. Instructor Kaveth stood at the edge of the arena, wearing his formal teaching robes and carrying the ancient Xerion dueling sword that had belonged to his family for 7 generations. The blade was a masterpiece of traditional craftsmanship, forged from ultra-dense titanium vanadium alloy and sharpened to a molecular edge. It had never failed him in combat, never shown even the smallest crack or flaw. Today he would face Sarah Chen in the final match of the day. The earlier examinations had gone well. Each student had shown improvement and growth, exactly as Kaveth expected. Some had performed better than others, but all had demonstrated mastery of the basic techniques they had been taught. But those matches felt different now. Several students had incorporated ideas that Sarah had shared with them. A Draconis cadet had used acoustic techniques to disorient his opponent. A Veil student had exploited electromagnetic interference to disrupt energy weapons. A Corvani fighter had turned her own cybernetic vulnerabilities into advantages by understanding exactly how they worked. The other instructors were impressed but confused. These were not techniques from any standard curriculum, yet they were clearly effective. Where did they learn these methods? Director Olthan asked Kaveth between matches. "From each other," Kaveth replied honestly, "and from asking questions that we never thought to ask." Now it was time for the final match. Sarah entered the arena carrying the dueling sword she had selected from the historical collection. It was a good choice. Well-balanced, properly maintained, and suited to her size and reach. She moved with the calm confidence she had developed over the semester, but Kaveth could see something different in her eyes today. She looked like someone who had been planning this moment for a long time. "Cadet Chen," Kaveth announced formally, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena, "you have requested to be tested with traditional weapons in classical single combat. Do you understand that this examination will measure not only your technical skills, but your understanding of combat principles?" "I understand, Instructor," Sarah replied clearly. Very well. Kaveth drew his family sword, the metal singing as it cleared the scabbard. The monomolecular edge gleamed in the bright light. The examination begins when you are ready. Sarah drew her own blade and took a standard ready position. For a moment they stood facing each other in perfect stillness. The arena was completely silent. Then Kaveth began his traditional lecture. Observe, cadets, he called out to the watching students, how proper distance is maintained in classical sword combat. Note the positioning of feet, the angle of the blade, the readiness to attack or defend. Combat is about control. Control of your weapon, control of the space between opponents, control of your enemy's options. As he spoke, he began to circle Sarah slowly, demonstrating the classical approach to dueling. She matched his movement, keeping her sword ready and her eyes focused on his center of mass, just as she had been taught. The key to victory, Kaveth continued, is to limit your opponent's choices while preserving your own. Force them to react to your attacks instead of pursuing their own strategy. Control the tempo, control the distance, control the outcome. He made a slow demonstration quality thrust toward Sarah's left shoulder. She parried it correctly, turning his blade aside with the flat of her own sword. The clash of metal echoed through the arena. Good technique, Kaveth observed. Now observe how I regain control of the engagement. He pressed forward with a series of traditional attacks, each one designed to force Sarah into a defensive position. She responded with the classical parries and blocks she had learned, but Kaveth could see that she was not just defending randomly. She was moving with purpose, studying his sword, watching how the force of each impact traveled through the metal. That was when Kaveth realized something was wrong. Sarah was not fighting the way she had been taught. Oh, her technique was correct, her form was proper, her movements were precise, but she was not trying to attack him or create openings for counterstrikes. Instead, she seemed to be testing something with each parry, each block, each contact between their blades. She was conducting an experiment. Your defense is adequate, Kaveth said, increasing the speed and power of his attacks. But defense alone cannot win a fight. You must create opportunities to strike back. Sarah nodded as she blocked another thrust. You are right about control being important, she said, her voice calm despite the rapid exchange of blade work. But I think you might be controlling the wrong things. Before Kaveth could ask what she meant, Sarah did something completely unexpected. Instead of backing away from his next attack, she moved sideways and upward, using the arena's raised border as a stepping stone. The move forced Kaveth to twist and adjust his position to track her movement. As he brought his sword up to intercept her altered trajectory, Sarah did something that no student had ever done in the 30 years he had been teaching. She grabbed his blade, not with her whole hand, which would have resulted in severed fingers from the monomolecular edge. Instead, her grip found the exact point where the tang met the guard, the one spot on the weapon where the stress of forging had created microscopic imperfections in the molecular structure. Pain should have followed. Blood should have flowed. But Sarah's fingers found their target with surgical precision, gripping the sword at the only point where the cutting edge was not perfect. At the same moment, her other hand struck the flat of Kaveth's blade at a precise angle and with exact force. The sound that followed was unlike anything Kaveth had ever heard in combat. It was not the clash of metal against metal, or the hum of energy weapons, or the crack of breaking armor. It was the sound of molecular bonds snapping under perfectly applied stress. The ancient sword, the blade that had served 7 generations of Kaveth's family, the weapon that had never shown the smallest flaw, broke cleanly in half. The arena fell into absolute silence. Kaveth stood frozen, staring at the broken weapon in his hands. The blade had snapped just above the guard, leaving him holding nothing but a useless hilt. The other half of the sword lay on the arena floor at Sarah's feet. Sarah landed gracefully from her leap, a thin line of blood across her palm, the only sign that she had made contact with a monomolecular edge. She looked at the broken weapon, then at Kaveth, then at the stunned audience filling the observation seats. You were right about control, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. But the question is not whether you can control your weapon or your distance or your opponent's choices. The question is whether you understand what you are really trying to control. She gestured toward the broken sword. Every material has a crystalline structure. Every weapon has stress points where that structure is weakest. Every technique assumes that certain things are impossible to change. Kaveth found his voice at last. The sword was perfect. It had no flaws. Everything has flaws, Sarah replied gently. The forging process creates stress points in the molecular lattice. The tempering leaves microscopic imperfections. The sharpening process creates irregularities in the edge geometry. No matter how perfect something looks, physics still applies. She turned to address the watching students and instructors. You taught me that combat is about control, and you were right. But you cannot control your opponent. They have their own will and their own plans. You cannot control the environment. It changes in ways you cannot predict. The only thing you can truly control is your understanding of how things work. Sarah picked up the broken blade from the floor and held it up for everyone to see. This sword was not defeated by superior strength or better technique. It was defeated by knowledge, by understanding exactly how much stress it could handle, where that stress should be applied, and what would happen when the breaking point was reached. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then Director Ulthen began to clap. Slowly, the sound spread through the arena as students and instructors joined in the applause. But Kaveth barely heard it. He was staring at the broken hilt in his hands, his mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. In 30 years of teaching combat, he had focused on techniques and tactics, on form and discipline, on the traditional ways that had worked for generations. He had taught his students to control what they could see and predict what they could understand. But Sarah had shown him something completely different. She had not just beaten him in combat. She had revealed that everything he thought he knew about fighting was incomplete. She had not controlled the fight by limiting his options or dictating the distance or forcing him to react to her strategy. She had controlled the fight by understanding something that he had never even thought to consider: the fundamental physics of the weapons themselves. And if she could do that with a sword, what else could she do with the same approach? What other assumptions about combat were wrong? What other impossible things were actually just waiting for someone to understand them properly? As the applause finally died down and the examination was officially concluded, Kaveth realized that everything was about to change. Not just for the weeks following Sarah Chen's graduation from the Galactic Combat Academy were unlike anything in the institution's 200-year history. Word of the examination spread quickly through military and academic circles across known space. Videos of the match were analyzed frame by frame. Scientists and engineers studied the broken sword to understand exactly how a human had managed to shatter what was considered an unbreakable weapon. Combat instructors from dozens of worlds requested detailed reports about the new teaching methods being developed at Zerion Prime. But the most significant changes were happening within the academy itself. Instructor Kaveth stood in his newly redesigned classroom, looking at equipment that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. Alongside the traditional weapons racks and training mats, there were now materials testing stations, molecular analysis devices, and holographic displays showing stress patterns in various combat equipment. His students, a new group of cadets from across the galaxy, were not just learning sword forms and defensive techniques. They were studying metallurgy, physics, chemistry, and engineering. They analyzed the weapons they used, understood the armor they wore, and questioned every assumption about how combat was supposed to work. Today we will examine energy blade construction, Kaveth announced to the class. The words still felt strange in his mouth, but he was beginning to understand their importance. Who can tell me why the focusing crystal in a Corvani energy sword creates heat differentials across the blade surface? 3 hands shot up immediately. A young Draconis named Scalebright answered first. Because the crystal structure channels energy more efficiently along certain axes, creating temperature variations that follow the lattice pattern. Correct. And why is this knowledge useful in combat? A Veil student named Crystal Song responded. If you know where the cool spots are, you might be able to grab the blade without being burned. Or if you know where the hot spots are, you could use them to weaken an opponent's armor through focused heat application. Kaveth nodded approvingly. Excellent. Now let us examine the actual temperature distribution patterns. This was the new reality of combat training. Students did not just learn to use weapons, they learned to understand them completely. They studied materials until they could predict failure points, They analyzed energy systems until they could exploit their weaknesses. They approached every aspect of fighting as a problem to be solved rather than a tradition to be followed. The results were remarkable. Graduation rates had improved dramatically as students gained deeper understanding of their equipment and techniques. Injury rates had dropped because cadets knew exactly what their gear could and could not do. Most importantly, the Academy's graduates were proving to be far more effective in real combat situations. Reports came in from across the galaxy of former Academy students using their new knowledge in unexpected ways. A Draconis officer had defeated a superior enemy force by analyzing their armor composition and creating a targeted acid that dissolved their protection. A Corvani pilot had saved her ship by understanding exactly how the enemy's energy weapons worked and using that knowledge to create electromagnetic interference that disrupted their targeting systems. But it was not just about winning fights. The new approach was changing how people thought about conflict itself. Director Ulthan called Kaveth to his office to discuss a communication they had received from the Terran Colonial Defense Force. The humans want to establish a joint research program, the director explained, his cybernetic eyes glowing as he reviewed the proposal. They are offering to share their analytical methods and scientific databases in exchange for access to our combat training facilities and alien technology expertise. What do you think of the proposal? Kaveth asked. I think it represents the future, Ulthan replied. The old ways of teaching combat, memorizing forms, following traditions, assuming that weapons and techniques never change, those ways are becoming obsolete. We need to adapt or become irrelevant, Kaveth understood. Sarah had not just demonstrated a new fighting technique. She had shown that the entire foundation of combat training needed to be rebuilt. Traditional methods assumed that weapons and armor and techniques were fixed, unchanging things, but in reality, everything could be analyzed, understood, and eventually overcome by someone with sufficient knowledge. There is something else, Ulthan continued. Several other military academies have requested permission to send observers to study our new curriculum. Some are even offering to pay substantial fees for instructor training programs. And what did you tell them? I told them that we would be happy to share our knowledge, Ulthan said with a smile. After all, if humans taught us that understanding is more important than tradition, then we should not keep that understanding to ourselves. That afternoon, Kaveth visited the Academy's research center, which had expanded significantly since Sarah's graduation. The facility now included laboratories for materials science, energy systems analysis, and weapons development. Students and instructors worked side by side, testing theories and exploring possibilities that would have been considered absurd just months earlier. He found Instructor Threx working with a group of advanced students on a project that perfectly embodied the new approach to combat training. We are developing adaptive armor, Threx explained, showing Kaveth a prototype suit covered with sensors and micro-adjusters. Instead of trying to make armor that can stop every possible attack, we are creating armor that analyzes incoming threats and adapts its protection accordingly. How does it work? Kaveth asked. A human student, one of several who had arrived since Sarah's graduation, answered enthusiastically. The armor uses real-time spectral analysis to identify the type of energy weapon being used against it, then adjusts its reflective and absorptive properties to provide optimal protection. For projectile weapons, it analyzes impact velocity and mass to predict penetration patterns and redistributes protective material accordingly. And for melee weapons? Kaveth inquired. It identifies the material composition and structural characteristics of the attacking weapon, then calculates the most effective way to deflect or absorb the impact, replied a Corvani cadet. It can even generate targeted electromagnetic fields to disrupt molecular bonds in certain types of blades. Kaveth shook his head in amazement. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed such ideas as impossible fantasy. Now they seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The transformation was not limited to technology either. The way students approached problems had changed fundamentally. When faced with a new challenge, they did not ask, "What is the traditional solution?" Instead, they asked, "What are the underlying principles? And how can we use those principles creatively?" This new mindset was producing solutions that no one had ever imagined. When a group of cadets was assigned to defend a facility against energy weapon attacks, They did not just install stronger shields. Instead, they analyzed the attacker's energy signatures and developed a system that could redirect incoming energy blasts back at their sources. When students were challenged to overcome a seemingly impenetrable defensive position, they did not try to break through by force. They studied the composition of the barriers and found ways to make them permeable to specific frequencies of matter and energy. Every problem became an opportunity to understand something new about physics, chemistry, engineering, or tactics. As the semester drew to a close, Kaveth reflected on how much everything had changed. His role as an instructor had evolved from teaching predetermined techniques to helping students discover new possibilities. His classroom had become a laboratory where cadets explored the boundaries of what was possible in combat. But the most profound change was in his own understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. For 30 years, he had believed that the best fighters were those who mastered traditional techniques and followed proven strategies. He had taught control through discipline, victory through superior skill, and success through adherence to established principles. Sarah had shown him that real mastery came from understanding. Not just understanding how to use weapons, but understanding how weapons worked. Not just understanding tactics, but understanding the science that made tactics effective or ineffective. Not just understanding combat, but understanding the universe itself. The human approach to warfare was not about overpowering opponents or outlasting them. It was about learning faster than they could adapt, understanding deeper than they could anticipate, and solving problems they did not even know existed. And now, thanks to one stubborn cadet who had refused to accept that some things were impossible, the entire galaxy was learning to think the same way. On the last day of classes, Kaveth received a message from Sarah, who had returned to Earth to help establish similar training programs for human military forces. The message was brief but significant. "Thank you for teaching me that combat is about control. You were right, just not in the way either of us expected. The universe has rules, and understanding those rules gives us control over everything. I hope the Academy continues to explore what that really means."